And this chapter is it's simple. It doesn't look kind of dramatic, obviously, in the way that the flood looks dramatic, or like Babel, or even when Abram goes to Egypt. Um, but it is a huge chapter because this is one of those chapters where character really gets revealed. And it just kind of shows us the kind of man that Abram is becoming and what kind of man Lot really is, and also how God is going to respond when someone chooses, peace and humility and trust. So it just kind of shows us something that's very true now, which is that not every decision that looks good is good, and not every choice that looks small is a loss. And so, sometimes the person who seems to kind of lose in the natural is actually the one walking in faith. Same thing with the person who kind of grabs the better looking option, could be walking into trouble. So this is kind of, what this chapter is going to be about. So the first movement is movement 1. This is when Abram comes back from Egypt and returns to worship. So this is verses 1 through 4. And the chapter opens up by saying in verse 1, and Abram went up out of Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south. So right away, this matters. Okay. So because Abram is coming back from Egypt, and Egypt in the last chapter was the place of, fear and compromise and just self protection. So Egypt was the place Abram ran to when the famine basically hit. And so it was just where he kind of stopped trusting God fully, right? He tried to manage his own situation and he ended up creating a mess with his wife and the Pharaoh. And so this chapter just really opens up by him coming up out of Egypt. Okay. And so physically, he's leaving, but spiritually, it's also return. This is Abram coming back from a detour that he had to experience. And in verse 2, it says, and Abram was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold. So he doesn't come out of Egypt, or he ends up leaving with wealth, and he's got livestock and silver and gold. But this is important because, he has the wealth, but that doesn't mean that Egypt was the right move. That is something, people can misunderstand all the time. Um, in real life, sometimes people say, well, it worked out, so it must have been God, but not necessarily. Sometimes God is merciful in the middle of our bad choices. He'll protect us and still let us leave with something. And so it doesn't automatically mean that the decision itself was right. And so Abram should not look at the wealth like he got in Egypt and say, see, I was right. The point is that God was gracious even in Abram's weakness. And then the chapter says in verses 3 to 4, and he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Hai, unto the place of the altar, which he had made there at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. So this is really beautiful because Abram basically comes back to the place where he had been with God before all of that compromise. And he goes back to Bethel, back to the tent and to the altar, and back to calling on the name of the Lord. And I think that this matters so much because when people mess up spiritually, they sometimes think that they need to now invent some dramatic new things to get back to God. But sometimes, getting back to God, it can just be a lot more simple. It's just returning to the place of obedience and worship and prayer, returning to the place where you left him. And so Bethel is associated with the house of God. That region later becomes very important in the biblical story because Shechem, which Abram had already passed through earlier, that's associated with the area near modern Nablus, which later becomes a big biblical location that's connected to Joseph and Joshua and Hebron, where Abram ends up later in this chapter. So this is one of the oldest cities in the region, and it's associated with other patriarchs. So Abram, he's basically retracing spiritual ground. He is coming back as a beginner again, okay? Which is encouraging, because sometimes, you feel like when you make a mess, you don't really know how to get back on track. And so this is kind of showing you that the way back is returning back to the altar. You don't pretend, obviously, that nothing happened, but it's returning back to God. And I have a question for you guys. Has there ever been a time in your life where you knew you needed to come back to the altar, not literally, but come back to prayer, to God, to obedience, to the place where you know that you were stronger spiritually? And I ask that because his return from Egypt, it's a picture a lot of us know personally. So now, for movement 2, this is blessing that creates pressure and strife breaks out. This is verses 5-7. So now the story kind of shifts here, because in verse 5 it says, "And Lot also, which went to Abram, had flocks and herds and tents." Okay, so Lot is blessed too. And that's important because Lot's blessing is connected to Abram. So he benefited from being near the man that God had called. Okay. But proximity to blessings is not the same thing as being spiritually mature. Okay. So a person can be close to someone who hears from God, but still not be walking closely with God themselves. Okay. And so in verse 6, it says, "And the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together." In other words, they basically had become too large to stay in one place without pressure. There's too many flocks, too many servants, too many needs. And so now the tension is basically visible. And in verse 7, it says, "And there was a strife between the herdmen of Abram's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land." So now their workers are fighting. There's tension. There's basically conflict right now over the resources. But notice the last line. So, "And the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled in the land." I'm going to confidently say some of these words here, but that basically means that people are watching. So this isn't happening in private. So it's basically like people that are in the land, like unbelieving people, they are in the land watching the people who claim to belong to the true God fight with each other. And that detail is important because one of the reasons Abram is going to address this really quickly is because conflict among God's people is bad enough, right? But if it's in front of the world, it's worse because it damages witness. And so it can make people around them say, "Oh, okay, so you're not really different that much, after all." And so, if we're being honest, this can still happen now. Sometimes people reject the message of believers because of the behavior of believers. They see, division, they see how they behave, or pettiness, or ego and control. And then it just kind of becomes like this stumbling block. And so this is a spiritual issue. And there's also something that's important here about wealth, because both Abram and Lot, they're wealthy, but they're not necessarily carrying their wealth the same way. So Abram has possessions, but Lot is more possessed by what he sees. And you'll end up seeing why that's a lot more clear later in the chapter. Okay, so wealth here is not the problem. The question is whether your possessions are serving God's purpose in your life, or if they're going to kind of quietly control your decisions. Do you guys think that blessing can, sometimes expose what's already in people rather than just make life easier? Because, in this chapter, the increase, it obviously doesn't create peace, it kind of just reveals, and you'll see more, just the kind of hearts that people have. Which brings us to movement 3. So Abram chooses peace over his rights. This is verses 8 through 9. So now he does something kind of interesting here, because in verse 8, it says, "And Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren." Okay, so Abram, he's older. He is the one that God called, right? He's the one that the land was promised to. And so he has every right to take the lead and to tell Lot what to do. But instead of coming in, hard and asserting his authority, what he does is he starts with peace, and he starts with a relationship. And he basically says, hey, we're family. This shouldn't be happening. And so then in verse 9, it says, "Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left." Okay. So this is a really, for the time that this is in, this is kind of like a really good offer, because he's basically giving Lot first choice. And so you're going to end up seeing that this isn't him, it's not even that he's like afraid or, or scared of confrontation. You're going to see that Abram is, fully capable of, action and courage. But what this is faith. He has grown since Egypt. In Egypt, Abram thought he had to kind of manage everything himself. And so here he's kind of relinquishing that. And now he trusts that no matter what Lot picks, God is still going to provide for him. Okay. So that is a really important moment, because it shows us what faith looks like when it matures. Sometimes faith looks like surrendering to the right to grab the right to grab first, because that God sees you anyway. Abram is not obsessed with controlling the outcome, because he knows God is over the outcome. And so this chapter is just kind of exposing here now two different mindsets. One of them says, I need to secure the best for myself. And the other one says, well, I can afford to be generous because God is the one who's holding my future. And so that's what he does. He chooses peace instead of being possessive. And he's basically had to learn that God can bless him whichever side of the land he ends up on. If you guys ever had a moment, where you kind of had to fight for something, but maybe you might have felt God telling you to choose peace instead. If you've ever had that, drop it in the chat. I think that this is just kind of showing that faith is about what kind of person that you become when there's pressure. Because when pressure gets applied, that is how you end up seeing the kind of person, that you're dealing with. In general, that's how it works in life. As soon as pressure gets applied, that's when the veil kind of lifts, right? So now in movement 4, I call this Lot chooses by sight, and that choice reveals his heart. This is verses 10 through 13. So now we get to another turning point here in the chapter, because in verse 10 it says, "And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zor. Okay, so Lot sees what looks best, right? The text is very intentional here. It says he lifted up his eyes. In other words, his decision is being driven by what looks appealing visually. And so the Jordan Valley was known for fertility and water, and the broader Jordan Rift Valley is still kind of like a striking region geographically. Okay, so it's running north to south towards the Dead Sea, which sits at the lowest natural point on the earth's surface. Okay, and so then it says also in that verse, like the garden of the Lord. So that's basically comparing the region to Eden like abundance. But right there, the Bible is warning us that the appearance can be deceptive because something can look like paradise, but still be spiritually dangerous. And so then in verse 11, it says, then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Okay, so let's go back to that phrase. Lot chose for himself. So that's a self-directed choice. He doesn't stop and ask, well, what is spiritually safe? He doesn't seem to pray. He doesn't ask, what environment is going to help him and his household to stay close to God. He is choosing what seems best materially. And then in verse 12, it says, Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. So that line is not a small line because Lot doesn't start inside Sodom. He starts towards Sodom. So that's basically how compromise sometimes works, right? It doesn't start with like a full rebellion. It begins with like direction and orientation and just kind of pitching your life towards something dangerous. And then in verse 13, it says, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. So that's, this chapter, it's being very clear. This was not a spiritually neutral place. Lot is basically moving his life towards a place that's been already marked by this extreme wickedness. And I think, one of the deepest lessons here is that the choices that people make end up revealing what's in your heart. And so his choice, it wasn't that it just kind of suddenly made him bad. It just ends up showing you what he already valued the most. He chose by sight. Abram chooses by faith. There's also something subtle here because Lot sees the Jordan plain and it reminds him of Egypt. That should bother you a little bit because Egypt in the last chapter was already a place of compromise, right? So it's not the place that God wants you to be. And Lot is attracted to something that resembles the place of a previous spiritual failure. And, if you think about it, that can kind of happen in real life too. People might leave one compromise just to be drawn towards a new version of the same thing because they never ended up dealing with the deeper issue that was inside. Have you guys ever noticed how compromise usually doesn't start with like this huge dramatic thing? It always almost starts with small steps and small directions and justifications. Lot didn't just wake up one morning in full destruction. He ended up moving there gradually. So now for movement 5, after Lot leaves, God speaks again. So now we're in verses 14 through 16. Then the chapter kind of shifts again, and it's important because in verse 14 it says, "And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him," that phrase matters, okay? After that, Lot was separated from him. So there's something about the timing that's important because once that separation happens, God speaks again. And, you know, I don't want to overstate it, but it does, the text here just kind of clearly marks that separation as something that's significant. And then God says, "Lift up now thine eyes and look from the place where thou art northward and southward and eastward and westward." And that's kind of, you know, beautiful because earlier in the chapter, when Lot lifted up his eyes, it was done so in a fleshly way. He was looking for what seemed best to him. But now God is telling Abram to lift up his eyes. So one man is lifting up his eyes on his own and he's choosing by sight, but now the other one is lifting up his eyes because God told him to. And now what he sees is a promise. And so then in verse 15 it says, "For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever." So this is basically God reassuring Abram. It's kind of like God saying, you didn't lose by being generous or by letting go, or by trusting me. The very thing that Abram was willing to release in being reaffirmed to him by God, and that's a very strong pattern here, because sometimes when you release something in faith, God answers you by reminding you that what he gives you is bigger than what you were trying to hold. It's not leaving you empty. And so then in verse 16, it says, "And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered." So, pay attention to kind of how interesting that promise is, because Abram is still childless. He's not looking at like a nursery full of kids. He's not looking at like, a big family already forming. He is a man without a child, and he's being told his descendants will be like the dust of the earth. So that is basically a promise that he obviously can't see, but he has to receive it just by faith. And so there is something, kind of comforting in that, because God repeats promises, because it's not the first time he's told Abram this. And it's usually because people need reassurance, right? A lot of times people think that repetition might just mean that maybe they didn't hear God the first time, but sometimes it's mercy. God understands that we need to hear him again. And I think that because Abram had just kind of come out of that failure that he experienced in Egypt, and he had gone through family, separation, God speaks again. Has God ever had to reassure you guys about something more than once? Maybe because, you were in a season where you needed to hear it again. This part is kind of showing you that repetition from God is a form of care. So now in movement 6, this is walk the land, live in communion, and build another altar. This is verses 17 through 18. And so then God says something, kind of interesting in verse 17. He says, "Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it. I will give it unto thee." So here he's telling Abram to walk the land. So this is kind of a very physical picture of faith, because Abram, he doesn't have a deed in his hand, right? Like, he doesn't have political ownership. He doesn't see the final fulfillment, but God is telling him to walk it anyway. It's kind of like he's saying, start moving through what I promise you, even before you see it just kind of fully happen. And that's, it's important, because faith, it's you don't just mentally agree with God. You have to start walking. You have to start, the way that faith starts is by inhabiting promise. It starts by moving like God meant what he said, even though you don't fully fully get or see the ending. And so in verse 18, it says, "Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord." So again, Abram lives with the tent and the altar. So the tent just kind of reminds you that he's still, you know, um, a pilgrim. He's not putting down, like ultimate roots in the world, as if the world just kind of has, as if this world is his final home. And so the altar is kind of reminding you that worship is supposed to remain central. He is still a worshiper before he is anything else. And Hebron later becomes one of the most important cities that's associated with the patriarchs. And so it has a very long history in that region. And Mamre is associated with that vision. So Hebron is associated with communion or fellowship, and that really fits him really well in this chapter, because he is walking in God's vision and he is living in communion with God. So Lot got like the greener looking land, but Abram got the deeper fellowship. He got what was actually better. Lot just ended up getting what looked better. And this is such a lesson for life, because the world trains people to think that the better choice is always the one that looks more comfortable, maybe more profitable, more strategic or impressive. But this chapter just kind of shows you that the better choice is the one that leaves you in communion with God. And so if you kind of step back and look at the whole chapter, you really see two men that are kind of standing at like a fork in the road, right? Abram ends up choosing peace and restraint and to trust and worship, and he's generous. But Lot is the one who ends up choosing comfort and something that just kind of seems better on the surface. One man releases and is affirmed by God, but the other one just ends up kind of drifting towards that disaster. And it just kind of teaches you that even though Abram, failed in Egypt, it's still possible to be restored. It doesn't end up as Abram being defined by Egypt. He ends up coming back. He calls on the Lord again. He makes peace and he walks by faith. He ends up building another altar, which is important, because sometimes we're hard on ourselves and we think that just because we had one bad chapter, it will just kind of define your entire spiritual story. But this is saying no. If you return to the altar, God is still able to move your story forward. And then, it also teaches you that not every type of increase is a blessing. Sometimes it's going to expose your heart. It's going to force choices. It's going to create, a strain. And so the issue is just whether it's pushing you towards God or away from God. And that's just, it's teaching you something really huge about discernment, because what looks like Eden can sit next to Sodom, right? it looks fertile, but it's actually spiritually poisonous. Um, I think that's why people just kind of need more eyes. They need discernment and they need God. And so if I could ask you something just kind of straight up before we close, it would be this. Where in your life are you being tempted to choose like Lot instead of trusting like Abram? Where are you looking at something because it seems easier or greener and more profitable or more comfortable and just maybe more secure? Because, you know, while maybe not asking what it will do to your soul, because that's kind of, the real issue here. What is keeping me in communion with God? Some choices are going to give you that short-term gain and long-term damage. And a lot of times the right choice is going to kind of feel like it's the wrong one, but in the long run, it will lead you just kind of feeling a lot more peace and clarity and having that relationship with God. Abram is basically showing us here that you don't have to just kind of grab to be secure. You can trust God enough to let him choose your future. And so, as we close tonight, this chapter is just kind of really leaving us with very powerful things to carry with us. It's just showing us that coming back from failure is possible. And that restored people have to keep growing. Egypt comes back from Egypt, he returns to the altar, and then he starts making wiser choices. And so that is how, you end up realizing that what he does is a lot more valuable. And it just kind of shows us, God is faithful to reaffirm his promise, always to the people who end up choosing faith over control. So that's probably the biggest takeaway from this chapter is how you choose matters. How you choose, which is by trust, moving towards God in the place of communion. So this is the Bible study. I want to thank you guys for being here tonight. I'm really grateful for every single one of you who show up and study with me and comment and ask questions and, help make this a real Bible study community. If this chapter helped you, just kind of understand Genesis more clearly, share the study with someone who might need it too. And if this was our first time together tonight with a Bible study, I would encourage you, to kind of sit with this before the next study, and just kind of ask God quietly, am I making the decisions by sight right now that I need to bring back under faith? And ask him very honestly if there's an area in your life where something looks good on the outside, but deep down it's pulling you away from peace and worship and obedience. So I know sometimes the most, spiritual corrections, they happen before the crisis when God is gently showing you the direction that we're leaning. So I'm really glad you guys were here tonight. Thank you so much. Like I said, if anyone does purchase anything from me, soap, hair oil, please send me a message. All of my followers get exclusive boxes. So that's all I have for tonight. Thank you guys. I will see you. I know, no spoilers tonight. I'll make sure tomorrow. Thanks, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.